Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So, Dane Axes. Let's talk a little bit more about Dane Axes. I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible to try and make my point as well as possible. So, I did make this point in my previous videos, but I maybe didn't make it obvious enough because obviously that was a longer video. So, the point is very simply that lots of people out there are making really nice axes, okay? So specifically the challenge or the quest that I was referring to was the search for this particular type of axe that we see in the Museum of London, as I've shown in my previous video and is showing here as well. And they are a specific type of very large but very thin axe, and that is the point. Yes, there are people, there is an episode of Forged in Fire where they make Viking axes, but the whole point is those axes are way overweight because they're too thick. Now, the thing that's particular about this type of axe, which incidentally, if we want to get academic, is the Peterson Type M axe. So Peterson made a typology of axes across this kind of general period, and the Type M axe is particularly large. I understand from subsequent postings, and I kind of knew this before, I think, that in Scandinavia this was known as the broad axe because it's broad, yet indeed there are different types of axe that were used in the Viking era and before it and after it, and some of those are thick, some of them have got different shaped, almost like T-shaped blades, some of them have got the more traditional kind of hatchet type blades, in various sizes, one-handed, two-handed, but this is a very specific type of axe that I'm talking about when I talk about the Dane axe, and in fact what most people these days refer to as the Dane axe. And these examples in the Museum of London are that. They are the Peterson Type M, and in fact there's another one in the British Museum, and there's other ones being found around Europe. You find them in Eastern Europe as far as Russia, and you find them in Scandinavia, obviously. In Scandinavia, incidentally, they've been and in, I think, in Poland and in Russia, they've been found in graves as well. As far as I know, none of these axes have been found in graves in Britain, because in Britain it was Christian at this time, and so they weren't doing that type of pagan weapon burial anymore during this period, although they did earlier. So the specific point is that this Peterson Type M Dane axe is very broad for the period, although not as big as some people think. They're usually about a 20cm cutting edge, so it's not huge. It's not like a fantasy Lord of the Rings dwarf battle axe, but they are big for the period. They're much bigger than most axes were at that time, and in fact in most other periods as well. But they're very thin, and when we say thin, what are we talking about? Well, okay, so if we look at a lot of the replicas that are being made, some of them by very good smiths, by very reputable makers, and this is why it's difficult for me to go, oh yeah, so-and-so, person X makes great Dane axes, I'll just go and buy one off them, because the very point is that a lot of the people out there making Dane axes are not, okay? What they make are not anything like what's in the Museum of London, and not very like the example in the British Museum either, and I'll make a differentiation between those in a second. The fact is that these blades are thin. How thin am I talking about? Well, they vary between 2 and 5 millimeters at the sort of thinnest part of the blade, the flat of the blade. And in fact, the examples in the Museum of London vary between 3 and 4 millimeters. Some people go, oh, but they're rusted away and they've got holes through. The fact is that that is an average of the thinnest part. That's an average of the thinnest portion of the blade. Have they lost some material? Yes, but how does rust work? It eats away the iron and builds up corrosion. So actually when something is rusted, it doesn't necessarily get thinner. Sometimes it can even get bigger. If we look at the objects pulled out of the Mary Rose, for example, the few bits of iron that are there, the corrosion sometimes builds up on things. In fact, there were very few iron objects pulled out of Mary Rose famously because of the salt water. But if we look at other objects pulled out of water, very often we see that they're not thinner than they were originally. It's just that you have pits where the iron's eaten into, and then corrosion that's built up. So anyway, To cut a long story short, the flats of the blades, the thinnest portion of the blades on these Dane axes or Peterson type M axes are around 3 or 4 millimeters. They're really, really thin. And yes, some of them have a reinforced edge. As some people pointed out, that could be an artifact of the manufacturing when you put the hard carbon edge and forge weld it into the iron body, essentially. That meeting point could be naturally forming that kind of bulge behind the edge. So it might be that those edges aren't supposed to be reinforced as such. It could simply be that that's the iron holding the steel. Absolutely, I can concede that. And it must be pointed out that some of those Type M axes or Dane axes have this bulged reinforced edge and some don't. Okay, so even in the Museum of London, as I showed, some of them have that edge, some of them don't. And the example made by Arms and Armour, for example, doesn't have that. It just goes straight to a thin edge, which with modern steel, with one mono steel, is mechanically no problem. And of course it means that the weapon's slightly lighter. So, the point is that lots of what people have said, they've gone, oh, but Matt, haven't you seen so-and-so Smith? You know, they have made a Viking axe, they have made a Dane axe. No, they haven't. None of the people, with the exception of a few makers who are specifically actually making, there's a couple of people out there who are making really good replicas of this specific type of Type M axe. The majority of people, the majority of smiths out there making Dane axes are not, they don't seem to have looked at the actual stats. So below here I'm posting a link to an absolutely fantastic article. I highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, you're interested in Dane axes, you go and read that article because it's got all of the facts and the figures in there. Okay, it's got it's not a very big article, but it's concise and it's got the facts and figures that you're most likely to want. So the fact is these blades are thin, usually 3 or 4 millimeters at the thinnest point. The sockets are relatively thin as well. They're not very built up sockets generally. There's no kind of big thick hammer section at the back. It's all light. They're weapons that are made to give a good amount of cutting edge for a minimum amount of weight. And what are we talking about when we're talking about weight here? 600 to 800 grams. Okay, 600 to 800 grams seems to be about the average of these Type M Dane axe heads. 600 grams to 800 grams. Okay, that's the weight of a light infantry saber. Obviously it's on the end of a stick, so all the weight's at one end. Well, the stick weighs a bit, but most of the weight's at one end. So it's a very different type of balance to a sword, but they are light. By axe standards, they are light. Now, the British Museum example, why did I say I'd come back to that? So the British Museum example is one of the largest and heaviest examples that we have surviving. Okay, it has a very long edge. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's something like 28 centimeters long, 280 millimeters long. It's a very large one. And not only has it got a long cutting edge, but the base of the blade is broader or deeper, shall we say, at the socket, and the socket is deeper than most of them are. So most of them that survive, for example, the Museum of London examples, come down thinner with quite a narrow socket, which inevitably makes them lighter. Okay, potentially less secure on the shaft as well, but it makes them lighter. Now the British Museum example weighs 966, I think it is, but let's say around 960 grams. Okay, so at 960 grams, the British Museum example is the heaviest one that I know the weight of. Okay, that's the heaviest original Dane axe or Peterson Type M axe that I know the weight of. Now, if we look at the replicas, lots of the replicas are 900 grams and higher, or 850 grams and higher. Some of them are over a kilogram, over 1,000 grams. And this is too heavy. The fact is, the heaviest surviving example that we have a weight for to hand in this article linked below is 960 something grams. Okay, most examples are 600 to 800 grams, so that's what we're aiming for. Okay, so what I'm looking for, And I'll throw the challenge out there again. Any makers who want to make me a Dane axe that meets these criteria, okay, the general shape of a Dane axe like the ones at the Museum of London, 3 or 4 millimeters thick at the thinnest point, reinforced edge, with a total weight of 600 to 800 grams. If you want to do that, then by all means make me an axe. I will feature it on the channel. I will review the axe. I will give you lots of publicity. And if I end up with more than one axe, then I will find something really creative to do with the remaining axes. I might auction some and give a bit to charity. I might give a couple away as prizes. It depends largely on how many axes I end up with, but I might not end up with any, but if I end up with just one, then I'll probably keep it, but if I end up with more than one, I will find a creative way of doing something with those other ones that I'm sure that you will approve of. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope this has made my point a little bit stronger, and I'm sure I'll be talking more about Dane axes in the future, and hopefully I'll be showing one and being able to do things with one and test one. I do know a couple of smiths out there who are now making axes to my specifications, so hopefully, definitely, we will end up with a Dane axe on the channel at some point. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.